Hello and welcome to the Game Changers podcast, where you'll hear from trailblazing, fearless women in sport. I'm Sue Anstiss, host of the Game Changers, a founding trustee of the Women's Sport Trust charity, and the founder and CEO of Promote PR, one of Britain's leading sports PR agencies. In this episode, you'll hear from the Telegraph's Anna Kessel, MBE, the first ever women's sports editor at a national newspaper, co-founder of the Women in Football Network, and author of one of my favourite all-time books, Eat, Sweat, Play. Anna talks openly about the sexism faced by females working in sport, why the profile of female sport matters so much for women and men, and how things are changing for the better. I met Anna at the Telegraph's fabulous offices in central London and began by asking her if she'd always been passionate about sport.
I didn't have a passion for sport for the longest time. I didn't engage with it at all. My parents had all sorts of political nervousness around sport. My dad's South African Jewish and, came from apartheid where sport was being used as a tool to oppress black people in South Africa. And my mum was a refugee from the Nazi era. And so, they grew up at a time where sport was very much used in a negative way. And I think it still sometimes is. So, and there was that nervousness around nationalism, growing up in the 80s, football hooliganism, the National Front, all of that stuff. And very often sport and the Union Jack went hand in hand. So there were many kind of cultural, political reasons that we didn't gel as a family. And then I suppose compound that with being a girl, going to school. Most girls weren't engaging with sport that I knew. And just from I can't remember since when, but I just knew that boys did sport and girls didn't really. Whether that was boys playing in the street and I just didn't play. Even though I played with those boys, I played other games with them, but I didn't play football. And I didn't know why that was. It just was.
And did you think about that at the time? You were a young girl. Did it occur to you to question why that was? Or?
There was something about it that bothered me, but I didn't have the confidence to sort of stride in, and I didn't know how to play football. So it's not like I was being prevented from doing something I really wanted to do, which, many female footballers have told that story. That wasn't me. But I didn't like the idea that there were things that girls shouldn't or couldn't do. And it was quite apparent that there were lots of things that girls weren't meant to do. And that definitely bothered me. So, fast forward to school and I bunked my PE lessons religiously. It was the only lesson I really bunked and nobody seemed to care. And that really brought home the message as well that actually it doesn't matter if you're here or not. And I think, add a layer on top of that, which applies to boys and girls, which is if you're not naturally sporty or athletic, then there's this kind of trend where some PE teachers, not all PE teachers, but I think too many, kind of disregard you. And that's not really allowed to happen in any other subject. If you're not very good at maths, your maths teacher is obliged to help you understand the basics and to give you that foundation. And I'd love to see that change much more rigorously in PE.
Do you feel that still is the case today?
People message me and tell me that is the case. And I think because PE is so neglected, whether that's by government and curriculum and not being a core subject, or whether that's by the societal cycles of head teachers and teachers going through bad PE lessons and then not valuing it or it being too left to chance. There's a legacy and a hangover from that.
So with that background of a family not watching plenty of sport and you're not playing, how did you come to be where you are today? And when did you find football? Because I guess that was one of your first loves.
Yeah, football was the first one. Well, there were a couple of people at school that played. One played for Millwall Lionesses and the other played for Arsenal Girls, and that really struck me that that's something different. And it's not like I then wanted to do it, but I found that interesting. Then Euro 96 happened, and that changed everything for me because it was, I say to younger people now, it's a bit like 2012 Olympic Games. The whole nation went completely football crazy, and women were more involved in that. Now looking back, it's in quite a sort of dated way, but at the time there was something quite radical about women being involved as fans. I think I just got caught up in that. And as a daughter of two parents who were not English, it was the kind of first time that I felt I could be part of this one big culture together. There were lots of flaws in that argument, but yeah, there was a sense of that, and that was exciting. So yeah, I started getting into Arsenal. I started writing geeky little notes that I'd, of how Arsenal were getting on, because they were my local team and everyone at school supported them. I'd stick little notes on my wall, and it developed from there. Yeah.
And if you could have your childhood over, what sport would you have liked to have played?
Oh, football.
It would have been football.
But I would have liked to do lots of sports, I would have loved to do athletics. That's a good question.
I can't do that for you, though, unfortunately, but good to think about it. I know you're so passionate about the power of female sporting role models to provide that positive impact for young girls. So why is that?
I just think if you grow up as a girl, it's almost like there's a room in your house where you're not allowed to go in. That's how I see sport in life. There's a sphere in the world that is hugely powerful, influential, that political leaders fall over themselves to get involved with. And women are obstructed from that space. And I think we cannot live a whole and complete life. We cannot really play a full role in society as long as that's the case.
I love that analogy. That's fantastic. Makes me feel a bit emotional, actually, but it's so true, isn't it?
Yeah.
And who inspired the young Anna Kessel in terms of female sporting role models or women that you saw in sport?
Well, my mum's Czech, and she was obsessed with Martina Navratilova. Yeah. Not only because she was Czech, but also she wore glasses, she wore shorts, and she loved that. And yeah, exactly. And I really liked that too, because I liked wearing shorts, and I didn't like that girls were meant to wear skirts and dresses. So yeah, even though I didn't really gel with sport, I wasn't a tennis fanatic. There was something about her being around that was pretty powerful, and she was brilliant at it. I knew that she was brilliant at it, and that was important.
And what inspired your pathway into journalism?
It kind of stemmed from writing those geeky notes about Arsenal. Yeah. I actually wanted to be a novelist, and I just thought journalism would be a stepping stone along the way, and that it would be a fun thing to do, a bit of sports journalism. I had no idea how hard it was to get into it, and no idea how gripping and brilliant it would be to be part of it. So here I am, as you said, nearly 2 decades on.
And was sports journalism the route in, or was it journalism and then into sport?
No, it was sports journalism from the start. I wrote to every broadsheet newspaper sports desk in the country and asked to come and do work experience. And
what age was that you were doing?
I think I was 24. Right. I'd graduated by then.
What did you study?
English literature. And only one desk replied. Thank you, Vicky Barrett, who used to be on the Observer Sports desk. She was the secretary there. And she, sometimes it's down to that one person. Absolutely. And she was aware that there were very few women coming through the desk, either being employed or coming to do work experience. And I think she just straight away sort of said, yes, come. And she let me come for a month, which again is quite a rarity. And then she let me stay. And then she got me a laptop. And then she got me a login. She just did. Okay. She got stuff done. And without her, and, I went on to have lots of other mentors. The editor was amazing, Brian Oliver and Oliver Owen too. But yeah, sometimes it's that one enabler.
Mm. And that's important to think for all of us, isn't it? Where we can be that enabler to make that small action that could have a huge impact on someone's future access.
Oh, God, yeah. Looking from the outside in, people might say, oh, Vicky, she was the administrator on the sports desk. But everybody has so much power, particularly when you're working in a big institution or a big corporation. And she used her power, and I just think it was brilliant.
It's fantastic to open that door, isn't it? Mm. And as a young female sports reporter, a very dominated world of sport, I'm sure you experienced your fair share of sexist behaviour. Is there any moments of significant impact how many that you could share with us? You're laughing.
Oh, there were just so many. And at first it was sort of, I was young and there was nothing so terrible that I was traumatised by it. It was stuff that I could brush off and perhaps didn't realise really the weight of what was happening at the time. I saw it as a bit of a challenge and I was like, I'll tough it out. But I think looking back, I realised more the significance of all those, some of them were microaggressions, as we say now. But it was things like I went to go and interview a well-known referee and a couple of referees, and they just refused to behave, and they refused to be interviewed by me on their own. They wanted to be interviewed together, and then they just kind of destroyed my interview, and they wanted to talk about my arse, basically. And, it was those kind of really just manipulative, stupid, immature kind of things. Or sometimes it was other journalists. I think as I got older, the stakes got higher. This was a career that I was now committing to. I got married, I started a family. And I think the structural issues really kick in then.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be a working mum with a child? Can you be a correspondent? What about when you've got to travel the world? What about the long hours? What about breaking news stories? Can the industry accommodate working mothers? And at the time, the answer definitely wasn't a resounding yes. And it's interesting that there are still so few working mums doing this role. And I'm really happy that both myself and Vicky Hodges, who's the deputy at the Telegraph, are both part-time working mums.
Fantastic that they've made that work. And just not taking you back to the sexism and so on. So how did you deal? Did you brush it off? Did you have a quip back to people? How did you feel you dealt with that?
Yeah, I didn't know how to deal with it. I read something recently that said women tend to do either freeze or friend. That's their response to kind of male aggressions or sexual advances. And I'd say that definitely resonates, because I either just sort of plugged up and didn't know what to say, or I'd kind of try and smile and laugh it off. But I wasn't part of the joke, so there's no point me laughing along. And I'd love us as women to think more about, yes, the onus should be on men not to do those things. That's number one. But also, what can we do for ourselves in those situations to kind of empower ourselves to just actually say, oh, sorry, I'm just going to stop the interview now because you're not behaving. And, I could have done that, but I didn't feel that I could do that. It didn't even occur to me.
And having that confidence as a young reporter, journalist, making your way in the sector too as well sometimes.
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. Is it still tougher for women to come into sports journalism than men?
Yeah. It is, because it's a male-dominated industry, and I think any time there's an imbalance, you could take that to apply to anything. It's a very white industry, even more than it's a male-dominated industry, and that's a massive discussion that we need to start having.
Clearly, you're doing fantastic work here with the women that you've got working on the paper and others coming through, and Rebecca Myers at Sunday Times. And, you look around and I see these amazing women having their voices. I can't remember the name. They were fantastic women at the Times. The young Hudson.
Molly Hudson.
I mean, it's just, that's been marvellous, isn't it, to see these fantastic women coming through. But do you feel there is a shift in terms of female sports journalists?
I think there is, but it's quite slow, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we look at the stats now and how few there are still, I think it was only a couple of years ago somebody did a research piece and female bylines were less than 2% in sports pages. So we've got such a long way to go. And, until women get into those senior roles where they're hiring and making decisions on sports desks, then it's even slower to change, whether that's the type of coverage that we do or the type of people that we hire. And it is different. We've seen it here. We've done a number of hires and we did a paid work experience scheme that we recruited for. And if you want to get ethnic minority, if you want to get women, you have to hire in a different way, and you have to change the language. And I think that's something that we're, as an industry, still waking up to and still figuring out.
What advice would you give to young women who are, and I'm sure we're both contacted by many, but women coming into sports journalism now?
Oh, yeah. Do you know, I feel like the industry and things have changed so much, particularly in regard to, you now have the option to cover women's sport.
Yeah.
Or to say, I'm a women's sport specialist. It's not guaranteed that there's necessarily a job, but there's more opportunities now for that, which I think in some ways is making women more accepted in this industry. I mean, the biggest thing for me has been about contacts and finding people who can help you, because the industry still isn't fair in its recruitment, in its promotions, in valuing who's great. I remember speaking to a very senior man in the industry about who they were giving a platform to, and he said to me, I only want the best, because I was saying you don't have very many women. And he said, I only want the best. And I said, well, the best is subjective. So your definition of the best might be completely different from mine. And he just couldn't get his head around that. And he was like, no, I just want the best. And I thought, oh God, this is a sort of constant conversation that I think we all come back to, and it's really challenging around recruitment to change that.
And you mentioned networks there, which leads me nicely into women in football. So in 2007, you and Shelley Alexander established Women in Football. So why did you feel there was a need for that?
It came out of those early experiences going to matches, having those kind of conversations. And I would do this thing where I'd look out for another woman, whether that was the receptionist or just anyone really, because often I wouldn't see another woman on a match day. And then I'd be curious about who they were. I wanted to catch their eye. My then boyfriend, now husband, used to talk about this I see you thing that black people do, or people of colour often do, where if you see another person who looks like you acknowledge each other, even if you've never met before. Yeah. And I thought that was something that we should do more as women. And sometimes as women, we sort of avoid eye contact. We're just so nervous to see anyone at times. Yeah. So I started to think about setting up a network. And initially, this was before I'd met Shelley, I went to see Kelly Simmons at the FA. And she was hugely encouraging. And she said, oh, this would be amazing, let's do it. All those millions of years ago, when we asked someone more senior at the FA, they said no. Because they thought the FA Council, which at the time was 91 men out of 92 people, would feel uncomfortable with the idea of women getting together. So that was 2006.
that one woman could have been within the network, couldn't she?
She could have been within the network. Yeah. So then it was actually my husband introduced me to Shelley, and Shelley was one of those people that just sort of put rocket power under it and said, look, it doesn't matter that we don't have any funding, we don't have the backing of a governing body, let's just do it. We'll find a room and we'll do it again. We'll get on with it. And now we've got over 3,000 women, it's over 10 years later.
And what are you most proud of those achievements over those 10 years, would you say?
I think there's lots of things I'm proud of, and lots of individuals that we helped along with the way, and the pro bono legal advice that we've been able to support women with, which has been amazing. Because if you find yourself in that workplace discrimination situation, it is just so harrowing. And I've spoken to some of those women and heard just how their lives were being torn apart. So to be able to help individuals has been great.
And that's been a key element of one of the...
Yeah, it has. And it's always been quite a low-key thing because we do it confidentially, so we can't talk about the cases. But yeah, and it's I'm really proud of that we're able to do it. And we're very grateful to have Mishcon Derea actually supporting that work. But more broadly, I think the fact that when we started Women in Football, there was a lack of understanding that women in the football industry was an issue, that sexism was an issue. People just didn't think it was. It didn't have media coverage. Today, if something happens, there'll be an article about it. That didn't happen then. And that conversation has moved on so much. And also at that time, we couldn't have predicted the growth of women's football as it has come to be now. So, yeah, it's been amazing that Women in Football has been able to play a part in that.
And you've moved on now from your chair role. So what do you feel the future goals for your successor are in terms of taking women in football forward?
Well, it's lovely to have somebody else running it. Oh, my goodness. Ebru Coxell, she's doing a fantastic job. We've got Jane Purden as CEO. Again, two women who are so senior in their career paths and so well respected. It's amazing to think that they're running it, something that was just an idea all those years ago. Just seeing them go from strength to strength, being able to help more women. I'd like to see, clubs and governing bodies and major players within the sports industry engaging more around what work can they do to actively support women in the workplace, because there's still so much discrimination that does go on.
You've championed women across the whole sector, so coaches, officials, administrators, players and media. And it's fantastic that we're seeing so many more women on our screens, in recently reporting on sport. So why do you feel it's important to have those female voices in media, print, television, etc.?
It's normalising massively. I'll never forget when my eldest daughter was, I don't think she was even 2. And was it 2013? Yeah, the Women's Euros were on telly. And normally we've always got a sport on in the house because both me and my husband watch it. And it's normally, men's Premier League football. But this was women's football, and it was the first time that she really stopped and paid attention to the screen. And I thought that was really interesting, that even at such a young age, she was picking up.
Saw herself.
Yeah, she saw herself. So, yeah, seeing Alex Scott on Sky Sports amongst the pundits, seeing a Jackie Oatley, a Gabby Logan, it's just so powerful. It makes women feel like they can be part of that. And also it changes the narrative. You saw the way Alex Scott talking about mental health issues as a pundit, changing the conversation. I like to think what we're doing here at the Telegraph, thinking about language and how we present sportswomen, just changing that story. We're so fed up of, we saw it around the Rio Olympics, wife of, or, husband proud of, all that nonsense. And as long as those kind of habits exist, women will always be belittled. So, yeah.
And what specific challenges do you think women in football media have faced? You mentioned Alex and Jackie and others there. Do you feel football is worse? I mean, obviously it's very high profile and that's fantastic, but is it worse than other sports for the negativity for those female presenters?
I think as one of the biggest sports, yeah, it is. I mean, I remember when Jackie was pregnant and she was working late shifts at the BBC, walking across a dark car park, 6 months pregnant, and she was getting these notes, threats at work. That's it. People say, you can brush off sexist abuse, but it can be really scary and intimidating, and that makes you question whether it's safe for you to continue your job. That's insane.
And what do you say to women that are coming through now who might feel intimidated by that vitriol that's thrown at female presenters? What is the answer, if not to brush it off, which isn't the right approach?
Let's not tough it out. I think generations that came before me, the women who walked that path, hats off to them, they're absolutely incredible. But too many of them sort of put on the stiff upper lip and got on with it. And I think my generation did that too much too. And I don't want us to pass that on to the next generation of women. I think we have to sort of put our hands up and say, no, come on, enough's enough. Let's call out problems when they happen. Let's ask for help of each other. Let's just not put up with stuff, because it just continues if we do that. And it's not that the onus is on us to stop it, but let's recognise the power that we have in the situation.
And a network, as you've said, with women in football, having others and us having this conversation now. I mean, recognising it's happening elsewhere can be a very powerful thing too. Definitely.
I mean, some of the best advice, some of the best, career moves have come through a network of women. I pretty much wasn't going to apply for this job at the Telegraph. It was advertised as a full-time role. I've got 2 young children. One is not at school yet, and it would be impossible for me to be a full-time editor. So, yeah, but the reason why I applied was because so many women messaged me and said, you are applying for that job, aren't you? And some of them really chased me about it and said, come on, just ask them if they'll do it part-time. And so I asked, and they did, lo and behold.
Brilliant. Women's games obviously seen enormous growth in the past 5 years, so funding and exposure and opportunities to play. And we've got some brilliant women, you mentioned Kelly and others working in the women's game, but we don't see so many women working across in the men's game. Do you think that's an issue?
Yeah, I do. I think in some ways it is binary, and it's important for the women's game to have its own separate identity and its own workforce. But if women aren't part of the men's game, and bear in mind that most of the money and the resource and the power and the decisions are in the men's game, then we can't benefit from it, we can't influence it, we can't change it. And I think there's things that both industries can learn from each other and ways that they can support each other too. And that's really apparent actually in this current case with US soccer and the women's team and the men's team now working together. And for the longest time, the women would make that comparison. We do better than the men and yet we earn less. And it's not that they're not making that comparison anymore, but they're much more sensitive about it because they worked really hard to get the men on board, and they realised that if they worked together they would have a much more powerful impact. So I think we need to think about that.
Your incredible book, Eat, Sweat, Play, published in 2016, my family got quite bored of me keep reading out another passage. Here's another fabulous passage, constantly quoting. So what was your drive? But you talked actually earlier, didn't you, about being a novelist, but what was your drive behind that book?
Well, it was one of those things where I had an agent and they said, you should write a women's sports book. And I said, I don't think I can do that. Because they had this idea that they wanted a kind of female version of Fever Pitch, a cross between Caitlin Moran and Fever Pitch. And I said, well, I didn't grow up, watching men's football or women's football, so I'd be a fraud if I did that. That's not the book for me. And it took me a really long time to realise that the story that I had to tell about not gelling with sport and that disconnect between women and girls in sport was relevant. Which is mad, really, when you think about it, because that's, in the main, that is the majority of women and girls' experiences. Yeah. But yeah, I guess it's that terrible cliche of imposter syndrome and all the rest of it. Once I got going on it, I started to really get into it, and I really enjoyed it. And I felt like it was a book that I was writing for, for my younger self, for all my friends outside of the industry who just, some of them quite like sport, but they don't regularly do it, they don't regularly watch it. They'll be excited about Wimbledon coming on, or they might watch a bit of the Olympics, but it's not their, they don't wake up, it's not their drive, their everyday drive. And I was really interested in how can we get those women to engage with sport, and that's a question I continue to ask myself every day, and something that really informs the work that we're doing here at the Telegraph.
And it was a little ahead of its time, almost in a way. In think of Sport England's This Girl Can coming on board, it was ahead of its time, very timely as it was launched. What were the key elements you hope people would take?
I felt like for many women they were living with sport in that compartmentalised way. Going back to that house analogy, it was like, well, there is a room in the house that I can't go into, but it doesn't really matter because I don't need anything in that room, and I've got all the other rooms in the house. And I wanted them to understand that the power. But firstly, the symbolic thing of not being able to access something in your life and what that does to you. There was this amazing coach that I interviewed from Iraq, and she was talking about working with girls in a people displacement camp. From fighting on the border, there'd been a lot of movement in Iraq. And she talked about how girls were afraid to kick a ball there. And she said, if you're afraid to kick a ball, imagine what other things are hampering you in life. It's such a simple thing. And that really resonated with me, because for most of my life I was afraid to kick a ball in case I did it wrong, or that thing when you're walking past a park and a ball flies at you and they're like, oh, can you kick it back? And you're like, oh God, or what if I kick it in the wrong direction, it's all going to go wrong. I just don't think we should be able to live like that. And actually one of my biggest joys was in the summer, we were in a playground and my eldest daughter Ella was just playing with her friends, and someone kicked a ball over and she just casually kicked it back to them, and I was like, yes. I love that she's just done that. She didn't even think about it, she just kicked it back. And that's, we've done a lot of work with her school to set up a girls football club and all that sort of thing. So yeah, I wanted women to understand that it was empowering to connect with sport, and then I also wanted them to understand the different benefits, whether that's in career, health obviously, motherhood, confidence, lots of different things.
So powerful. And as you mentioned, so earlier this year you announced as the Telegraph's new women's sports editor, the only national newspaper that has somebody in that role. Was it a very difficult decision for you leaving the Guardian and the Observer after so many years of, and I guess that support and your growth through there too?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, myself included, thought I'd stay there forever.
Right the way through you almost.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously there's a lot of synergy there. But what the Telegraph was doing was just streets ahead of anybody else. And nobody else had any plans to do anything like that. And so it was just irresistible. And I'm so glad that I did make the move. I've loved every minute of it. I've been really taken aback and touched, actually, how it's a project that the whole company seems to have taken to their heart. Very early on when I joined, I was getting emails from somebody who works on cruises, from the business desk, from travel, from family, from features, right across the paper. Everybody wanted to get involved. And that was really, they had a real emotional connection to it. Sometimes it was because they had kids, or maybe they had a sister who played football, or, perhaps they'd just got into it themselves and started watching women's football. I didn't expect that. So long women's sport has been a sort of thing that people feel they probably should do. I didn't expect to have that kind of passion and drive behind it, not just from within our little women's sport department, but from right across the company. That's been really cool.
And your manifesto at the outset, can you tell us a little bit about that as you launched?
Yeah, so unprecedented coverage of women's sport, which, to be fair, starting from a very low baseline of 2% newspaper sports coverage dedicated to women. I don't know what the stats are now, but gosh, it's, rocketed. So we have a whole department. There's myself and Vicky Hodges, the deputy. We've got 3 full-time women's writers, football and then across sports. We've also got a rugby writer who splits her time between men's rugby and women's rugby. We've got a cricket writer who splits her time between men's cricket and women's cricket, and then right across the paper, athletics, cycling. Everybody is doing both men and women's sport, which is really, really exciting, actually. Yep, also to champion more female voices. So we've got an amazing string of sportswomen columnists, which is fantastic, but also wanting to give opportunities to freelancers where we can, and exploring new voices. So, it's been great to have someone like an author, Porna Bell or Caroline Criado Perez writing about sport. I find that really exciting to take people from outside of sport and bring their perspectives in. And kind of playing with that. And then the third main thing really was the campaign. And that surprised me that Adam Sills, the head of sport, wanted to do that. He said, what do you think about a campaign? We were thinking maybe something around school sport and girls. I couldn't believe it. I was like, seriously? Oh my God. Because in the time leading up to joining, I'd spent quite a lot of time emailing people and Sport England saying, look, what can we do about this? I'm desperate to do something.
When we've met and talked before, you've announced the role. That was a conversation we'd had too. Yeah.
Exactly, and that was my burning passion. I couldn't believe somebody else wanted to do it. I was so thrilled. So we launched this campaign, Girls Inspired. I hardly did anything on it. It was Jeremy Wilson, who's been amazing. He really drove it and engaged government and lobbied ministers and so on. So that's been phenomenal. And then the government really said, when they announced their school sport cross-party action plan, they acknowledged that we'd played a really important role in influencing that. And
in terms of the content, so I flicked through the paper again today and there's 3 or 4 fabulous pieces in there. So every day more content within the main paper, and then the supplement as a monthly supplement with an amazing body image issue. I got quite a bit emotional reading that last weekend. And that will continue. So what other content, not that I need more content about, but what else are you looking to do in the future?
I think we want to do more digitally. The supplement that we do every month, I love that to bits, and it has a different tone and a different voice and different voices to a regular sports section. I very much feel that we have 2 audiences for our coverage. There's a traditional sports audience, which is mainly male, but includes women sports fans too, and they have certain expectations about what traditional sports coverage should look like and the certain elements that you have to have. And then there's a newer audience that we want to speak to, which is predominantly women, but also men and non-binary who may not previously have picked up a sports section, or perhaps just binned it as the first thing. So many of my friends, they literally pick up the paper, bin the sports section or recycle it. I really want to speak to those readers, and that's what the supplement's all about. And that's wonderful. It's once a month, but I'd like to continue that conversation more during the month, have more opinion pieces online. We're going to be hiring a digital specialist just for Telegraph Women's Sport to work more on that.
Been 6 months, a successful 6 months. What challenges have you faced, would you say? Has it all been smooth sailing?
Oh, gosh. Well, the best thing is that everything I've asked of Adam, he said yes to. Yeah, I mean, you can't ask for more than that, can you? He's been an incredible boss, and I think, his valuing of the project, I guess, lies so much in the fact that it was his idea. He spent 18 months bringing this together. Goodness. Finding, the finance for it, backing of the company. He did that incredibly difficult groundwork, which nobody could see. Yeah. So he wasn't getting any thanks or praise. I turned up on the day that we launched. It was my first day. Stood on the stage and everyone went, "This is wonderful." And I hadn't done anything at that point. So, it just goes to show that when you invest in something and you put the time into it, you care more about it. And that's why it's important not just to leave that work to women or to people who care about it, but for everybody to get involved. Yeah, so I've loved all of it. Of course there's challenges, and we're talking about changing a structure. I don't just want us to work in silo. You know, we have women's sports specialist journalists, but it's really important that we work right across the range of writers that we have. And so that means having conversations about, okay, what's our content then going to be? I know you've written for 30 years and you've won every award under the sun, but and it's been wonderful that those writers have been really open to that and interested and keen to do something new and fresh. But yeah, that's obviously a difficult conversation. From my perspective, I don't want to come in and say, oh, actually, you've got to change, because these are highly respected individuals.
And across the sector, whilst you're here and having success here, I feel I've seen the impact of other people sitting up and taking note and perhaps taking women's sports journalism and reporting women's sport more seriously too, which is, I guess, a positive thing for the sector, the wider sector too.
Yeah, I really hope that it's a huge kick up the arse for everyone else to do much, much more and to be bolder with it. You know, Adam could have just hired one person to do a bit, but he's hired an entire department. And I think, really, if you want to make change, you've got to be bold. Yeah.
Are there any subjects on female sport that you're wary of covering or that you haven't covered?
I think we've knocked through so many taboos in women's sport. I think back to 3 or 4 years ago when there was a nervousness talking about menstruation. Now I feel like we write and talk about menstruation every other week. Yeah. And I love it. You know, you can sit on the desk and, you know, the guys are like, oh, it's really fascinating, and, you know, pelvic floor dysfunction and incontinence and menopause and all this stuff that previously we just couldn't talk about. And now...
And sport's a fabulous vehicle to have those conversations and for the wider society and officers to be aware of too.
And it's a really integral part of women's sport. You know, we're talking about enabling women's sports performance, and you can't do that without addressing all the different
female body
things. It can be female body, exactly. It's a madness. So yeah, it's been great to kind of champion those things. I suppose the one biggest issue that I don't know what the answer to it is trans, and how do we approach that? How do we solve it? I don't know how we solve it.
I haven't asked people through the series of podcasts about that, because it's like there is an issue there, but if you don't have the answer, there's so much vitriol that's thrown around on both sides. It doesn't seem to be a constructive conversation around it. So I almost haven't gone there I feel the women I'm talking to probably have a similar opinion too, really.
Yeah, I really do. I think that even when people have been well-meaning, someone like Martina Navratilova, who I respect hugely, when she came out and wrote that opinion piece, I hate to say anything negative about her because I just think she's incredible, but the language that she used was so disrespectful. And I think no matter where you sit on the spectrum, you have to come with respect when you talk about it. And if you don't, A, no one's going to listen, you're going to get everyone's backs up. But B, I just can't really... I can't take your point of view seriously unless you're able to discuss it in a dispassionate way, in a calm and dispassionate way. So, yeah, there's still a lot of thinking to be done about that.
Yeah, and discussion. Yeah. We hear a lot, don't we, about sport being at the tipping point for women's sport, at the point at which everything changes forever. Do you think we're there yet? Are we there now?
Yeah. What is the tipping point?
I think that's, I guess the theory is that in a Malcolm Gladwell fashion, it's the point at which enough has been done that you've almost broken down that barrier, you've opened that door, and everything changes from that point onwards. So, and people talked, didn't they, 2012, 2015, this summer is the tipping point of, have we done enough? Are we there? Is the only way up now from here?
Yeah, I think it is. There's something about that phrase that makes me nervous. And we use it all the time for women's sport. But it's almost as like, when you see a bucket tipping, which I did the other day in the park when my kids went to the seaside park. There literally was a bucket filling with water and it splashed and they all screamed and loved it. It kind of denotes that it's a singular moment.
Yeah, an avalanche of something.
Yeah, exactly. And in that singular moment, enough can change.
To never go.
Yeah, exactly. Or to name it, or, I just feel that the weight of history is so heavy on everything that we do that there can't be a singular moment. If we can have lots of little tipping points or watershed moments, then I think we are having those, and they're really important to have. But I don't think there can be a kind of singular change moment.
I thought it was your appointment, actually.
Oh, you didn't.
You've achieved so much in recent years and had this amazing impact on women's sport. So what's driving you now? We've talked about at the Telegraph, but for you as Anna Kessel as well, what's driving you?
I'd say the biggest thing that drives me is my kids. Because you see the way that society behaves, you see it so starkly. The way that kids then respond to that and receive it. Simple thing of going to buy school shoes the other day. And we go into Clark's, and Clark's have made a big effort to not call things boys and girls shoes anymore, which is wonderful, but they still arrange the shoes in boys and girls shoes, and they still manufacture boys and girls shoes. So even when we went to the PE plimsoll stand, there's one side it doesn't say boys, but it covers the whole foot, and there's another side it doesn't say girls, but it's open, it's flimsy, and it's got a sparkly flower on it. And I just said to my daughter, look, I'm not getting the flower ones because they're not going to support your foot. And it's not going to keep you dry if it's raining when you're doing PE. You can't kick a ball. You can't kick a ball. You can't run around properly. It's so fundamental. And yet when you talk about things like that, there's such a resistance. And people say, why are you complaining about that? But that's one of a million different examples I could give you about things that my kids come into contact with to do with, it's not even about sport. I don't care if they never play sport in their lives, really. I just want them to be physically confident and active and have that positive relationship with their body. And we're still so far from that. And that's mind-boggling in 2019. Yeah, that does upset me. So I think we've got a really long way to go.
And if you could change one thing, so media coverage, professional contracts, the funding coming into sport, spectators at events, do you think there's one element that will have the biggest impact on sport? Is that not really a question?
I mean, it's all of those things, isn't it? I know that's such a cop-out answer, but you can't have one without the other because they all depend on each other. Media broadcast are more interested when there's bums on seats. Bums on seats, they're more interested to go when it's a big thing on the media, so they all feed into each other. But I do think getting people into stadiums is massively important. And also thinking about, thinking a lot about football with the WSL season about to start. Yeah. What does that look like? When we watched the Women's World Cup, people got really into it. We saw those record figures. I wore one of the football shirts down the market on the weekend, and a man said to me, "Oh, that's the women's football shirt, isn't it?" And I said, "How do you know that?" And he said, "Because I watched the Women's World Cup." So, that's a more ordinary conversation to have, which is wonderful. But when they were watching that World Cup, and when my kids were watching it, they saw it dressed up fancy. They saw that really slick production, fantastic pundits, slick studio, amazing stadiums, big crowds, not enough big crowds in all the stadiums, but there were enough big games where it was full. The WSL is going to look nothing like that. And we need to be so much more ambitious for our domestic league here. Yeah, I think sometimes women are too grateful for small things that we receive, and I really want to see, that ambition lifted. Yes, we have to be realistic, but if we don't put the ambition on the board in the first place, we might never get there, or it will take much longer. So please, can we have big, fancy, shiny, cool stadiums for our sportswomen to play in, full of people, with the best media presentation? Why don't we want that? I do.
What an extraordinary woman. How could you not be inspired by all Anna's done to shift the dial for women's sport across the last 2 decades? It was really kind of her to take the time to meet with me when I know she's so incredibly busy as the women's sport editor at the Telegraph. I'd love to know what you think about the Game Changers podcast, so please do leave a review or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. You can also find me across social media at Sue Anstiss. You can make sure you don't miss out on future episodes by subscribing to The Game Changers and find out more about all my guests from Series 1 and 2 at promotepr.com/gamechangers. Next week, I'm talking with Jo Adams, CEO at England Netball, who's recently announced her departure from the sport after an incredible 9 years. Jo's brought huge sponsorship into netball, driven substantial growth in TV audiences and spectators, increased grassroots participation, hosted a slick home World Cup, and if all that wasn't enough, on her watch, the England team won that incredible gold at the Commonwealth Games.
Well, have a look at the big sports in this country, how many women run them, how many women make those long lists to even have a shot at some of those jobs. I'm running one of the most successful sports in this country. My name wouldn't have appeared on any of those lists.